In his 2013 book, The KLF, Chaos, Magic and the Band Who Burned £1,000,000, John Higgs argues that Doctor Who has become the most expansive and complex non-religious fiction ever created. And once you wade through the overflowing and perhaps now even bloated heap of television episodes, novels, comics, audio dramas and more that have spawned since the series' birth in 1963, you may well be inclined to agree. Doctor Who as a current brand arguably churns out more annual content than any other British intellectual property. But what is it about this ridiculous and endearing family show that has resonated so strongly with UK households for almost 60 years? And how has the show changed and evolved to reflect the Britain into which it was broadcast? To find the answer, it's worth going all the way back to the series beginning in 1963, and then back again to the series' rebirth in 2005. On Friday, the 22nd of November 1963, John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States of America, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. From 6:30pm that night, the BBC played only rolling news coverage of this historic moment until 5:16pm the next day, when normal programming resumed in the form of a new children's science fiction programme, Doctor Who. It was initially deemed quite unremarkable, but from the very first episode, the content of Doctor Who seemed to have an eerie resonance with world events. As Elizabeth Sandifer points out in her TARDIS Eruditorum essays, the futuristic psychedelic blur which represent the opening credits seem oddly quaint as the symbol of the youth revolution has just been gunned down in Texas. The opening series of the show focuses on a pair of headstrong school teachers, Ian and Barbara, who are curious about a strange student, Susan, who seems to know a lot about the past and future, but not so much about the present. Concerned, they follow Susan home, where they wander into a humming old police box stood in a junkyard, and within it they find the TARDIS, a time and space machine that is bigger on the inside. They are then abducted by Susan's grandfather, a mysterious, almost sinister old man who claims to be from another civilization. This man, dressed eccentrically in Edwardian clothing, calls himself the Doctor. In his 60 years as a popular character within British culture, the Doctor would appeal to the audience in several different forms, from John Pertwee and Tom Baker's action men with quips, and even reaching geek chic sex appeal in the 21st century, with David Tennant and Matt Smith dominating Tumblr forums. It's fascinating then to view his initial form. William Hartnell plays the Doctor initially as the borderline antagonist, who launches the protagonist into terrifying adventures through no will of their own. Aloof and condescending, the Doctor seems to appeal to the audience through sheer mystery, and commands status with his immense sense of superiority. But when acclaimed screenwriter and enduring populist Russell T Davies revived the show in 2005, he realised that the character of the Doctor needed to be almost unrecognisable to connect to 21st century audiences. As Sandifer discusses, Christopher Eccleston's image as the great actor of the working class is in direct conflict with Doctor Who's then perception as a cliched Edwardian stereotype of Britain. A lot of this change to the show's aesthetic came through the social class of the companions, and as a result, the environment the show would base itself in. In the show's original form, everyone from the supporting cast, the aliens from a supposed faraway world, would speak and receive pronunciation English. Davis's Who, however, proudly puts the story of a single mother and her daughter from a council estate front and centre. And Christopher Eccleston's skin-headed, leather jacket-wearing Northern Doctor skewed every preconception of the character in the public eye. Matthew Jones suggests, interestingly, that Eccleston's outfit is not only reflective of Doctor Who's new identity, but also the new identity of Britain itself. In the same way that Eccleston's modern outfits separate the Doctor from the trappings of his past, the UK too is attempting to construct a new identity in the 21st century, disassociating itself from the colonialism and exploitation that had been the hallmark of its modern reputation, thus too dressing itself in the clothes of modernity rather than its outdated and now problematic history. The core dynamic of Doctor Who involves the Doctor being superior to his companions on an intellectual level, a dynamic that becomes uncomfortable when noticing the middle and upper class characteristics the character of the Doctor has generally promoted. The contrast then between the middle-class schoolteachers Ian and Barbara and Rose Tyler, a 19-year-old retail worker who proudly calls herself a chav with no A-levels, is a stark example of the revived show's need to change its look. Sandifer notes how Rose as a character was designed seemingly because of how much she differs from the so-called traditional companion template, describing her as a character who would never be caught dead watching a show like Doctor Who. Rose's interaction with Eccleston's Doctor bring the show firmly into the realm of a working-class soap opera, and much to its benefit. While 1963 audiences were drawn in simply by the mysteries and curiosities of Strange New Worlds, the British public of 2005 were significantly more familiar with science fiction and all its genre tropes. Davis smartly chooses therefore to subvert expectations by bringing the show's inherent oddball nature into full contrast with the social realism of the soap opera. But while the relatability of the characters was a huge step towards connecting with contemporary British audiences, perhaps the more subtle and interesting device was the use of allegory in both the original and revived series of Doctor Who, to reflect the political trends of the time. In only the second serial of the show's original run, we are presented with a distant, nightmarish future planet society with several similarities to the fears rife in 1960s Britain. The Doctor and his companions land in a petrified forest on a dead planet. The jungle's trees and wildlife are frozen stiff, unflinching, while the only sign of life hums from a strange metal city in the distance. Falling sick from radiation poisoning, the protagonists encounter the Daleks, strange pepper pot robots who speak and glide in alien ways. Except they may not be so alien after all. The Daleks, Doctor Who's first ever attempt at monsters from another world, are quite clearly based on the Nazis. They are obsessed with racial purity, intent on exterminating anything that is not Dalek. They lift their plunges into one-arm salutes when addressing their leaders. Even their sing-song voices bark in a manner reminiscent of British satire's various portrayals of Hitler, shrill and one note. For an audience of parents who had likely served in the war and an audience of children who had been raised in the shadow of fascism, these parallels would have been immediately stark and obvious, and apparently effective. The success of the Daleks proved crucial in the show's burgeoning popularity. The aptly titled Dead Planet also struck a chord with 1960s audiences. World War II may have been won, but the dropping of the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima in its final act traumatised a generation. This faraway world with no society, only radiation and ruins, reflected the mass paranoia around nuclear weapons that had dominated the media and culture in 1963 and the Cold War. The BBC's Strange New Children's Show was presenting mums and dads with their worst nightmares. And while the Cold War may have been a thing of the past by the time of Doctor Who's 2005 reboot, nuclear paranoia was still very much present within British society of 2005. Russell T Davies' more modern take on the programme, however, found a more critical way to play on the audience's fears. While the show's original run was born in the shadow of the Second World War, the first series of the revival was equally born into the shadow of 9/11, and Tony Blair's subsequent decision to send troops to Iraq in 2003. Halfway through the show's 2005 series, Tony Blair's New Labour won a third consecutive term in the general election, albeit this time in the face of growing unpopularity, largely as a result of the Iraq War. So in the series' fourth episode, Aliens of London, depicting an alien spaceship crashing into Big Ben and the corpse Prime Minister who looks suspiciously like Tony Blair falling out of a cupboard, audiences were unlikely to praise the show's subtlety. The new government, secretly a race of green, pot-bellied, farting aliens called the Slovene, because why not, then conned the public into a need for nuclear war, through faking a supposed threat with weapons of mass destruction. As Alex Charles discusses in his science fiction studies essays, the Slovene Prime Minister's declaration that they have found massive weapons of mass destruction capable of being deployed within 45 seconds echoed the British government's account of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction capable of launch within 45 minutes. While Doctor Who often deploys allegory to represent issues of the time within the programme, its satire is rarely subtle, and certainly not here, as the Doctor and Rose directly reference the Iraq War. Do you think they'll believe him? Rose asks. They did last time, the Doctor replies. When Tony Blair was elected in 1997, ending Britain's 18 years under a Conservative government, the Labour Party's new approach was wildly popular, but by 2005 it had won an election by the skin of its teeth, with mass criticism from both the left and right. Aliens of London's critique of New Labour, then, taps into the show's long history of representing contemporary political trends and fears in order to produce effective storytelling, connecting the audiences by telling them accessible stories about their own political realities. And while these political commentaries may opt for directness over subtlety, they offer an insight into Doctor Who's vitality within popular culture. It's a ridiculous, camp and often cheap franchise, undoubtedly, but at its best, it's a perfect time capsule into Britain, representing what the British public feared and felt in the mid-20th and early 21st century, while creating enduring stories and iconography in its own right. Doctor Who may not always have been good over its 60 years, often you could argue it's been outright bad, but it has always been necessary.